I think at the time there was...
Oh, that's Jack trying to call me on Slack.
Oh,
Hello, sorry, I'm literally in the middle of a podcast. Okay, can I call you at 6 then? Okay, it's going well. You're probably going to be in the intro.
Sure it is, right now. Oh no, it's the problem.
Yeah, sorry.
Okay.
All right,
See you soon.
bye then.
hello and welcome to another episode of the TLDR News Podcast. I am Zach Michaelis, TLDR Editor-in-Chief, and I'm joined today by Ben Blissett.
Hello.
Yeah, how are we?
Good. I mean, it's another week in the campaign, isn't it?
It is indeed.
It's I think it's exactly 3 weeks until polling day.
Oh, very exciting.
Yeah.
So in this video, our podcast, we are going to be looking mostly at the Tory collapse. We're going to be taking a sort of like tangential look at the manifestos as well, because it has been manifesto week. Before we get into it, I am contractually obliged to plug the magazine that we are doing called Too Long, which is available over on the TLDR store. It doesn't come very naturally to me. It's not a very British thing to do, but I really do genuinely think it's a really good product. We did a newspaper that's quite similar at the end of last year. I was really proud of the content we put out there. I think in lots of cases, we don't really get to go into as much depth as we would like to when we're covering a story. And the newspaper one, this time the magazine, it's full of slightly more in-depth coverage, maybe slightly more intelligent coverage, if I can say that much. And yeah, I was really proud of the one we did last year. I really do think it's a good product. And it's a great way of not just supporting the channel, but supporting independent media generally. So I'd be really, really grateful if you do want to, if you could, buy the magazine. There is a promo code of this podcast, which is...
Bite the Ballot for £2 off.
Bite the Ballot for £2 off. Is it capitals or just...
I think it should work with either.
Okay, there we go. So Bite the Ballot for £2 off. I mean, that's such a bargain. Please. All right, let's get into it. As we said last week, we're going to split this podcast into 4 parts. The first is our favourite campaign moment. So, Ben, what has been your favourite campaign moment since we last did the podcast?
I mean, there's a few to choose from, isn't there? And
they're all Ed Davey related.
I mean, there's a few to choose from, and every one of them is Ed Davey. To be honest, look, I know that the last time we discussed this, I had some personal issues with the way that the Lib Dems were in their campaign. But objectively now, I'll put on the record that it just is working for them. There is an uptick in the polls. People are responding well to this kind of campaigning. There's some people that I've spoken to in my own personal life that sort of agree that they're not the biggest fan of this kind of campaigning, but I think that they're in the minority. I think the vast majority of people do appreciate this kind of campaigning, and this sort of, like, as you say, is running quite a fun campaign, but also using that to try and get a message across. So look, I'm on board with that now, or on board with the merits of it. And I think the most interesting one was the day that he launched his manifesto. So that was Monday. He launched it in the morning and then went to Thorpe Park for the afternoon and was pictured on a variety of different rides there. There's a great few photos of him on the roller coaster, especially because there's a couple of his other MPs sat beside him who are clearly hating it and just do not like being on this roller coaster. But look, the point is we're discussing it. The point is that, we're discussing it and other people
and he's
are
up in the
discussing
polls.
it. He's up in the polls. I think the thing that I find most interesting is that Sky News, there's a particular journalist, I forget his name, at Sky News, that has committed to interviewing him while he's doing these activities. So the first one was with him kayaking, and there's him on a kayak, and he's like struggling to keep the kayak straight while he's holding a microphone.
Yeah, that's a very good video.
Another one.
There's one on the slide when Ed Davey is straddling the reporter as they go down a water slide.
Yes.
That's good politics.
Yeah, but he's been doing it from nearly all of the activities. He's there with a microphone doing the activity and trying to do... There's one of him on the teacups, that was it. He was on the teacups and he's being like slung around in the teacups.
Yeah,
and he sat there trying to interview him, which is good.
Well, I think we often overestimate, because we're politicos, that's a bit of a grandiose term, but we're politicos ourselves, and we often overestimate how much normal people are into politics. Ben Walker at the New Statesman is constantly saying that, like, on average, your average median Brit spends 5 minutes a week looking at politics news. And so you forget that so much of politics and so much of sort of a politician's success is vibes. And Ed Davey has got really good vibes. Safi is my wife. I showed her a video of Ed Davey looking really funny and sweet and grinning as he fell off a paddleboard, and she's voting for him.
Really?
I don't know if that bears too well on Safi, but I mean, I think she's in some
this gonna
sense
be the
reflective
new-
of the median voter.
Is this going to be the new way of measuring the
sentiment.
median voters,
Yeah.
the Safi factor?
I no
whether
longer listen to
Safi-
polls. I just listen to Safi. Anyway, I think so. I think that obviously I agree with you. My most enjoyable moment of the campaign has been basically any Ed Davey stunt. But one of the other
I've
things,
noticed from the Slack channels.
yeah, I'm constantly plugging Ed Davey. One of the things I think I actually did enjoy, because I think it's interesting, is I enjoyed the way that ITV released the Sunak interview. So for context, Sunak came back early from the D-Day celebrations to do an interview with ITV's Paul Brand, where basically he was pushing back against these allegations that this £2,000 tax figure that he's been using to attack Labour is a lie. So saying no, actually these are fair statistics, and this was coming out in full on Wednesday evening at 7 p.m. But ahead of that, ITV started teasing clips which just bore so badly on Sunak. Sunak looked terrible in them. So the first one that they released was him, basically turning up and apologizing to Paul Brand for being late and being like, "Oh, the D-Day celebrations just ran over," which makes him look even more dismissive of D-Day.
Sorry to
well,
have
thank
kept
you. No, not at all. I know you've been in Normandy.
Yeah, it all just ran over. It was
course.
incredible, but it just ran over everything.
I'm sure it was
So apologies for keeping you.
No, not at all. I'm sure it's a powerful trip. I mean, so pertinent as well this year, considering what's happened in Ukraine.
Yeah, which I
and,
haven't seen President Biden's remarks, but I think that's kind of the echo, I think, what he said.
And then there was another one, the Sky News one, where they released the clip of him, Paul Brand, asking, "Yes, so how do you relate to normal people? Did you anything you went without as a child?"
Bad as well.
And Rishi Sunak said, "There's loads of things I went without, loads of things I went without." And he kept on saying it. And the first thing that came to mind was, "I didn't have Sky News as a child."
What did you go without as a child?
We went out with lots of things, right? Because my parents wanted to put everything into our education, and that was a priority.
So what sort of things had to be sacrificed?
Lots of things, right? So,
Can you give me an example of
All sorts
something?
of things. So, like lots of people, there'll be all sorts of things that I would have wanted as a kid that I couldn't have, right? Famously, Sky TV. So that was something that we never had growing up, actually.
Sky TV.
Whatever. Fair point. But obviously this didn't go down well. I mean, you know what I mean. It's not particularly relatable. I can't really. I don't know how much I like that sort of politics where it's the sort of like man of the people politics. But I think it wouldn't have played well with voters, and it probably would have had a bit of cut through. The reason I like this moment in the campaign, it's not for part-time reasons. I don't just like the Tories failing. What I thought was interesting is it's what happens when a leader basically gets in a really, really bad position. The media stops respecting them as a prime minister. Do you see what I mean? Yeah. And then they just become an object of ridicule. I think if Sunak was polling 10 points higher, there's no way that ITV would have basically taken the piss out of him.
But this is what I've said, and I've put this in videos on the UK channel since the start, is that they built a narrative around him that he's a failing prime minister. And you saw this even in the first, when he first announced it, he went out and he was in the rain and he was pissing it down and he had the Labour anthem in the background. And that set the narrative. Yeah. It was already a prime minister who was calling an election 20 points behind. And then he did it, getting absolutely drenched and drowned out by, things are going to get better. So that very much set the narrative. So the media were just looking for other opportunities to exploit that narrative. So then you had, for example, the photo of him on the plane, right, with the exit sign.
Yeah, we talked about this last time.
But this is it. Like in any other situation, that just wouldn't. No one would even really think to take that picture.
So you want to flesh that out a little bit? What was the photo? The
photo was he was on his plane. He was stood up, and just above him was an exit sign with arrows pointing either side. So it's basically just the implication that he's going to be exiting politics, and just sort of like just a way to ridicule him, really. Yeah. It was just an.
But you're right. In normal times, photo. That wouldn't be a humiliating photo.
Wouldn't be. No, it would.
We wouldn't read into the subtext.
You wouldn't
like
know.
That.
But people read into the subtext because the media were deliberately trying to build this narrative because it had already been set as of the start of the campaign. So now they're really looking. And to be honest, you don't have to look too hard to find, bad photos of him and things like that. Like it's quite easy to perpetuate that narrative, and that is exactly what they've been doing.
Yeah, I think also if you are going to survive that as a politician, if you are going to survive ridicule, you have to have a real sort of like statesman-like confidence. I don't want to just go back to how much I love Macron, but I think Macron, for example, there's this image of him in the French press that he's this sort of like arrogant pseudo-intellectual. And I know his polling isn't great, but he survives it by sort of like exuding confidence and sort of just pushing through. And Sunak just doesn't have that character. Do you know what I mean? Yeah. Like it clearly, it takes its toll on him, but also like he doesn't have the sort of like statesman-like qualities that might sort of like allow you to weather that media storm. And I think this takes us quite nicely onto the main bit of the podcast, which I said a minute ago is going to be about, I think both, it's the Tory collapse generally, but it's both about, I would say, the poll ratings, which have continued to look pretty miserable for Sunak. But then also, I think about the trajectory and about like the fact that there just doesn't seem to be a way out. It doesn't seem like this is like a sort of temporary slump or it's triggered by one specific event. I mean, it just does feel like the trajectory is just down from here. So when we did the last podcast, there was a bit of a dispute almost between us where I said that I thought that the gap would close between Sunak and Starmer. And because I just don't think Starmer is a 20-point leader, and I still sort of stand by that. But you said that he's trapped in a doom loop. And I think at the time it could have gone either way, but I think the D-Day thing has cemented it. And the D-Day has really pushed him into it. Well, not just one doom loop. I think there are a series of doom loops going on. I think there's the media thing that we talked about where when once people stop taking you seriously, it's very hard to be taken seriously again. I think there's also the unity within the Tory party. I mean, as the polling's got worse, you've seen unity break down, which is amazing during an election campaign. I mean, we had an article from Sola Braverman saying that they should join up with Reform.
Which is just, that's who they're fighting at the minute. That's like the main opposition they're trying to stop votes being given to.
You have Penny Mordaunt sort of refusing to defend Sunak at the leadership debate when she basically just said, he was a pillock at D-Day. And then you've had David Cameron this morning. I think he's at least like explicitly, he's not dissing Sunak, but it's quite tongue in cheek. He gets asked questions like, if you were Prime Minister, would you do that? And he goes, well, maybe I would. No, I don't think I would. That sort of thing. And the subtext, the sort of like the wry smile, it all suggests that like he knows that Sunak isn't quite up to task.
Yeah.
And yeah, I think the one piece of really clear evidence we have for this is a poll by YouGov, isn't it?
Yes.
That came out a couple of days ago. Only poll I think we've seen at time of recording since the D-Day event. Yeah. And if I remember correctly, I don't actually have the precise numbers here, but I think Labour you do have the precise numbers, please.
Yeah. So I do have the numbers here. So it's YouGov, as you say. So Labour on 38, the Tories on 18, Reform on 17, the Lib Dems on 15. So 1 point separating the Tories and Reform, and then 3 points separating the Tories and the Lib Dems.
And nominally, the gap between Labour and the Tories has narrowed in a way I was right. But A, not really, and B, if you plug those numbers, obviously, into an election forecast, the outcome is wild.
Yeah, absolutely wild. It would put the Lib Dems as the second largest party.
Yeah, they get about 60 seats, don't they?
Yes.
And then
roughly.
Tories get about 50.
Yeah.
And then basically Labour get 450, 500 sort of seats.
Yeah. Reform still only get, I think, one.
Yeah, a handful.
But yeah, that is true. I mean, obviously, the Tories would get a higher vote share than the Lib Dems because of first past the post. The Lib Dems would actually end up with more seats. But as you say, that would mean that Ed Davey would nominally be the leader of the opposition.
Yeah.
Which is,
again, an insane thought.
It's really worth caveating this with, this is one poll and it's not an MRP poll. So, doing assuming a uniform swing like that has quite large problems.
It does say something about the fractured nature of British politics.
But what we can take from that is that it does show you how bad things are for the Tories right now. It's unlikely that a situation like that exactly would happen, but it shows how bad things are for the Tories. That is true. There's no denying that. The fact that you've got polling within a campaign period putting reform within 1 point of the Conservative Party. I mean, again, the historical precedent for this isn't there. It doesn't exist. There isn't one.
Well, it's Canada.
Yes, at least in this country there isn't one, which is insane. I mean, obviously everyone.
A bit of context there, I think, from what she's explained.
Yeah, exactly.
Reform were actually named after a Canadian party that was formed in the 90s to sort of squeeze the Canadian Conservatives from the right. Nigel Farage will be very explicit about this. It is literally modelled after the Canadian Reform Party, and that Reform Party ended up killing the Canadian Conservatives. I think in 92 or 93.
It's 93.
They were squeezed by basically Labour in the centre, and then the Reform Party on the right. And they were sort of merged with Reform afterwards, or usurped really by Reform afterwards. Going back to what you said, the thing I think that's most amazing about this is that it's not just that there's a 20-point lead between Tory and the Labour. It's that the political landscape is so fractured.
Yeah.
I mean, first past post is explicitly supposed to guarantee against this. I mean, it's the whole reason we have the two-party system, first past post, all that majoritarian stuff. And we've never had, I mean, if that polling actually translates the election, we will never had anything like that.
No, and that would be, I will be unequivocal about this now. If anything like that ends up being true, if you see that the Lib Dems on a higher seat share in the election than the Tories, that's the end of the Tory party as we know it. They'll probably still exist as a party, but coming back from that is incredibly difficult. I mean, properly difficult. Because not only would that set, if you're seeing the fragmentation of the party as you're seeing it now, you're seeing it with them, as of a few weeks ago, in government, you saw that fragmentation. You're seeing that fragmentation within an election campaign. Can you imagine what that would be like after the election when blame is starting to be assigned and you're choosing a new leader? Like that would be huge. Secondly, obviously, you would lose quite a lot of media. Like, there'd be a lot of media interest in the first few months when they're selecting a new leader and everyone's reacting to what's just happened. But beyond that, you're no longer the second party. You don't get questions at PMQs. You don't get, the media doesn't care. You get less funding.
What's it called? What's the funding called?
I forget the exact name.
You get less public funding from the government.
Yeah, exactly. You get funding for being the opposition, effectively.
Yeah.
So all of that starts to dry up, and then that's a very, very bad position to be in for the next 5 years until the next election. And the idea that you can sort of like rally the troops and come back fighting in the next election is wishful thinking, to be honest. Like if that happens, that is the end of the Conservative Party as we know it.
And the sensible part of me just thinks that can't happen. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like, I just can't imagine those numbers actually manifesting at a general election. But there's a part of me that thinks actually maybe this is an underpriced outcome, because I think a couple of things are simultaneously true. I mean, basically, when you see those numbers at the YouGov poll, what you're really seeing is the Conservatives falling to their sort of lowest possible number. Let's just say that there are 20% of the population at least who just will vote Tory, who are just wedded to the Tories in that sense. And then you're seeing Labour sort of coming down a bit from their highs, which does feel plausible to me. And then you're seeing Reform and the Lib Dems jump up. I think that the thing that makes me think this could actually happen is I think that actually, even if it becomes clear as we near a general election that certain Reform and Lib Dem votes will be wasted, if you're a potential Lib Dem voter and it's first past the post, I should really vote for Labour or the Tories, given that they're going to win. And you're a similar thing with a Reform voter. I mean, it's especially true for Reform voters, given that the vote isn't concentrated in particular constituencies, unlike with Lib Dems. So if you vote Reform, chances are, unless you live in Clacton, you're wasting your vote. But you would think that those votes would then start sort of redistributing back to basically parties that can win seats. So in most cases, the Tories and Labour. But I think that's not true for two reasons. I think if you're a potential Lib Dem voter, you're looking at the polls and you're thinking Labour are going to win either way. I can risk my vote on a Lib Dem candidate, basically, because I'm not worried about the outcome. I know what the outcome is. It's a Labour majority. And if you're a Reform voter, it's in many ways a protest vote. Reform is a protest vote. And so you're not going to be swayed really by pragmatic considerations about electoral math.
Also, when you're starting to see national vote share at the level it is, the point of a protest party is to get attention and all of that. And your vote, even though it's not electing an MP, it's having the impact it's sort of designed to have as a protest party. Yeah. It's like that argument of dissuading because you won't elect a Reform MP sort of, I don't think works either. I think the Tories are banking on trying to use an argument like that, because you've seen in the last couple of days that they've started to use the argument of like, don't give Labour a supermajority. Like that's their framing now. And it's a dangerous strategy, right? Because you're sort of tacitly accepting defeat, and no one wants to be tied to a losing party. So it is a risky strategy. And we'll have to see whether that argument works. But I agree. I'm also sceptical about that argument for the reasons you've just sort of outlined. It must be a really, as I say, it is just this doom loop. It's just this doom loop, like reinforcing. Tories, It's so tricky.
Yeah, exactly. That's another point as well. I can't see the Tories really jumping up off that base, that 20%, which I think is their sort of like lower threshold. I can't really see them improving on that. I think one of the things that you've seen in the Tory campaign, you mentioned the doom loops. There are various doom loops going on. We've just mentioned them about the media and the Tory disunity. But I do think that what the last couple of weeks have betrayed is what I would just describe as like an institutional incompetence. Like there is a sort of overwhelming, pervasive sense that the Tory party and its machinery is just far less competent than it used to be. Do you see what I mean? I think this is hard to really pin down or articulate in really precise terms. But there is just this sense that some of the mistakes that Tories have made recently, like the Sunak D-Day gaffe,
I was about to say that's the biggest one.
You can't really imagine them being made by a previous Tory administration. Like you can't imagine like David Cameron making that mistake. And other politicos have pointed out, they said that, in my day, someone on my team would have said, come on, this is a massive gaffe. You know what I mean? Like someone would have said that we shouldn't be doing this. I think you see that with some of the other stuff, some of the way that they sort of manage the parliamentary party has been particularly ineffective. And I do think that it's a symptom of this sort of wider issue, which is, I think in some part it's because being a Tory MP is not an attractive proposition, and the quality of Tory MPs has definitely declined over time, in part because they've kicked out some of the sort of like old big beasts. But then also there's this like really difficult problem, which is that no one, I don't know how to like say this without sounding almost part-time, but no one really wants to, no one competent wants to really work for the Tory party. It's a losing bet employment-wise, not a great thing to have on your CV. And after a while, you do get this point where actually just the sort of like quality of the personnel within your party machine has declined so far, both at the MP level and at the sort of like SPAD assistant level, that it's just not a competent vehicle. And I think that is really what's happened. We've really seen that recently. And conversely, I think partly by circumstance and contingency, and I think partly in response to the Corbyn years, Labour's had the opposite experience, where Labour now does look like a far more competent machine.
Yeah, I sort of agree, and I think that the thing that makes that worse, as you've already said, is this D-Day situation. Is that in the campaign, I think up to that point, it could be that Sunak had a bad start.
Right? Got
like
unlucky.
You're
right. The umbrella thing is another example,
turning,
of that, isn't it?
Turning point. Yeah, that could have just been. It's an unfortunate start, and then there were a couple of hiccups with photo opportunities. He had the day off, and then he did the whole. Almost like restart of the campaign with national service. And sure, a lot of people didn't like it, but it was sort of appealing to a very specific group of people. And polling suggests it does poll well with the people he's trying to attract. So that could have been like a reset point. And it's not doing great and everything, but at least it's a semi-competent campaign. But the D-Day thing, I think that is a massive turning point in the sense of that resonates with everyone. There was a poll also done last week by YouGov where they asked people in the country and they could type their responses. They could give any response they want. There wasn't like a list of things. And then they used AI to categorize them. And they asked them like, what news stories have you heard this week? And there was the top one was that I forget what his name is, but the news presenter that went
Michael Mosley.
Yeah. So there was him. The second one was Sunak leaving D-Day early. Then way below that was the D-Day commemorations happening, and then just below that was the general election campaign. Like that, it is cut through so much. And as I say, there just isn't enough polling yet to see the effect. But the very limited polling that we've had has suggested that this is not doing well for the Tory campaign. So I think in the next few days, when we start to get some more polling out that was conducted in the days after the D-Day debacle, that's when we're going to start seeing how much of an impact this really has had. And so far, the indications are that this has had quite a large impact.
The last thing I want to say before I think we move on to the next section is just that I don't think we're politically or like psychologically prepared for that outcome, the one where there's sort of that distribution of votes. Because I don't think with first past the post, sure, you get majorities on 40-45% of the vote, but we would have never had such an enormous majority, a 200-seat majority on 38% of the vote. That is just, it sort of, for the remaining, let's just say like 60% of the population, it does sort of strain the notion of losers' consent. Do you see what I mean? It will put strain on that note, on that concept. If 70% of the population, or 65, whatever, have voted for the party that hasn't won, have voted for a party that hasn't won, and the party that has won overwhelmingly, it's just sort of like, it's so disproportionate that I think it strains your politics in sort of slightly weird ways. I think you see it in America when like there's the amount of pushback you get over just the electoral college when, for example, Trump won with a minority of the popular vote. And we're far more temperate, the British electorate are far more sort of like quiet and accepting of the system. But you can imagine it would just, you see what I mean here? It would just make it very, very weird if the vast, vast majority of people had not actually voted Labour, but Labour ended up with this sort of overwhelming 75% of seats in Parliament majority.
I mean, electorally, it would make Starmer the most successful politician, again, electorally, that the country's ever had. In the sense of
it'd be the biggest majority of all time.
But not only would it be one of the biggest majorities of all time, it would come from, even as I've said before, even a majority of one would require the biggest swing because of the historic defeat. You'll have gone from 2019 to Labour's worst defeat since 1935 in only 5 years to its greatest success on a very small increase in popular vote share.
I have a question for you because you're good at the history stuff. So if those numbers were manifest at the general election, 38%, 500 seats, would that be the lowest percent on which a party has won a majority? It would be the biggest majority in history, potentially on the lowest winning
I don't
percentage
have the exact
in
numbers,
history.
but if I had to guess, I would say that probably is true. There's no other election I can think of where that's happened. The other thing to bear in mind is that throughout most of post-war history, a lot of the elections have actually been relatively close, and it has just been between the two major parties. In the 80s, you had the Liberals and the SDP at one point sort of threatening, and that was an exception. But you've never really had a proper insurgent party split the vote in the way that it has. Obviously, again, 2015 UKIP, but that didn't have the effect. It sort of drew from both of the parties, and they were both quite close. 2015 was already quite close. So yes, it sort of hurt the Tories a bit, but analysis since then has shown that they actually took votes kind of from both of them, and it was a close election anyway. This is taking away from one main party. As much as they all like to say, "Oh, it'll hurt Labour as well."
Do you want reform?
Yes, reform. Sorry, they won't. It just isn't. They might take some votes from Labour, but they've got votes to,
It mainly
to
hurt
lose.
the Tories as well electorally. The way the maths pans out in the first past post system, it mainly hurts the Tories.
Yeah.
Although you do have a sort of not quite equivalent but similar thing going on with the Lib Dems. The Lib Dem surge is sort of nicking. Well, actually,
It isn't, 'cause they're
it's
standing-
more even, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah. And also, it actually probably hurts the Tories more proportionately than it does Labour.
They're targeting the Tories, and it's not like a pact or anything, but they've sort of tacitly.
Yeah, there was something going on there. I think Ed Davey did actually say explicitly at some point in the campaign, my aim is to get rid of the Tories. It's not Labour. It's to get rid of the Tories. I guess,
I just think the stars are properly aligned for Starmer in
My
in
goodness,
this
they
election.
really, really have. The other thing, although we talked about this last week as well, though, is that we say the stars have aligned for Starmer, and the subtext there is that Starmer isn't, again, as I said, he's not a 20-point leader. He's not like a super charismatic leader. Or he hasn't got the most exciting policy offer, which I think is both things are probably true. But and I think this was interesting. I think you saw this in last night's debate. We had another debate here in the UK where it was a one-on-one between Starmer and Sunak, and basically Beth Libby gave them both. It was basically 40 minutes each to talk about their policy and then answer some audience questions. And the polling after that suggested that Starmer won it 2/3. 64% of people thought Starmer won it. And I think this goes back to that thing we were saying earlier, which is that I think Starmer's not a 20-point leader because I sort of expect a slightly more presidential, statesman-like leader. And I think actually after the experience of basically 14 years of the Tories, I think that the British electorate actually wants someone a bit more personable and sort of likable and soft. And I think Starmer is that. I think he's more...
I thought you were about to say Ed Davey's that.
Ed Davey is that, which I think is one of the reasons that Ed Davey's doing very, very well, by the way. Is he's that to the extreme. But I think Starmer he's not going for that sort of Cameron-esque, sort of very, very professional, very, very political statesman vibe. He's got a slightly more Man of the People is pushing it a little bit, but he likes to talk about his dad as a tool maker. And
boy, does he like talking about that.
Yeah. But and he also he's just a bit more personable than he is political.
Yeah.
And I think that actually the polling, at least from that debate, suggests that is what the British public want at the moment. We don't want a Cameron. We want someone a little bit friendlier because we've had enough of politicians, haven't we? The elites. Yeah. Anyway, so I think all in all, we basically think going very, very badly for the Tories. Do we think any way back?
No, I still think I stand by what I said a couple of weeks ago. That whatever you do is not going to work because you move to the centre, you're alienating Reform voters. You move towards Reform, you're alienating the centrist voters. This mindset is already set in by the media.
You move to California, you get a nice holiday.
Well,
yeah, you've already seen that, yeah.
Or a job with Elon, which I'm absolutely sure is going to happen. But no, there just isn't anything. It's too short. There's too little time left. The narrative's already set in. There's no way you can move that works.
Yeah.
It's just...
I think the manifesto is maybe his last chance.
Yeah, I honestly thought they'd do a Hail Mary in the manifesto and come out with some really radical policy.
Again, by the way, I think this is a symptom... Yeah, exactly. I think it's a symptom of institutional incompetence. I think if you'd had a smart team, you would have gone, our only chance here, guys, is something radical. We have to go big here. And in the end, it was this sort of terrible middle ground where it was... radical enough in terms of how much money they want to spend to be implausible. People just went where, you've been saying for the last 4 years, the piggy bank is empty, or 2 years, whatever. And now you're saying you're going to find £17 billion worth of tax cuts.
Yeah.
But not sufficiently radical to actually be eye-catching or interesting. Just sort of the same old sort of like a tinker with national insurance, a tinker with income tax, over the next decade or whatever it's planned to be. And so you basically end up annoying skeptical Tory voters and not dragging anyone over to you.
Yeah. When the manifesto came out, I just thought that they tried the national insurance thing, the national service thing. And while it seemed like it didn't necessarily work, because it was ridiculed by quite a lot of sections of the media, I do still think that it works in terms of it was designed to appeal to a specific section, and it did. And I just thought they might have looked at that and gone, if we can do a couple more of these in the manifesto, then we can try and convince that like reform voting bloc that they can trust us still. Yeah. And I'm sort of surprised they didn't go with that.
I guess in Sunak's defense, two things are true, right? Which is that one, he's never going to sort of like outright wing Nigel Farage, I guess. I think that's always a tall order. I think even if you came up with some pretty strong stuff on crime punishment and immigration, which is sort of classic red meat reform voting policies, Farage just has more credibility on those issues, even mainly because he hasn't been in government, so he hasn't actually do it. He's just been railing against it. But then also, I think, you know, with the national service thing, the main criticism he got there was, why haven't you done it? So if you come up with too many radical policies, people just go, well, you've been in power for ages. Why haven't you done these? True. I mean, he's just caught in a sort of straitjacket of circumstance.
But I just think in that situation, it makes it seem to those people that did want to vote Conservative but feel like they can't because they're not, you know, they're not right-wing enough, or they think that they've gotten too close to the centre, then it persuades them you don't need to vote for reform because we are that. And I get that it's not an ideal strategy. I get that you're still going to lose, and obviously you're still going to have that criticism. Well, you've had 14 years to do it. Why haven't you? But to the people that you're appealing to, I don't know how much that matters.
So I think all in all, this is a very long-winded way. We both agree that things are going very, very badly, and we can't see anything through. I think actually just wargaming it just there, you can't really see a way through. There's nothing. I do. There's a part of me that feels sad for him. I think he's just, it's so much of it's circumstantial, and he's going to go down as, you know, the man who brought the Tory party to its death.
Just need to get rid of that genie that's working overtime for Starmer, because honestly.
Alrighty, let's go on to the third bit of the podcast. Yeah.
Yes.
Small parties.
Small parties.
Small parties.
I mean, I feel like we've spoken about one quite a lot.
I think we should speak. We have sort of spoken about two, but I still think that we talked about reform last week. I think it is time to talk about the Lib Dems a little bit.
Oh, I thought we'd already discussed them a bit, but
we
can discuss
them a bit more. You did the manifesto video on the Lib Dems.
Yeah.
What do you think of it?
I think they're really, really trying to appeal to young people. There's just so many, like, your classic young people bait. It's sort of like, you know, we'll legalise cannabis, we'll give 16 and 17-year-olds the vote, we'll reform the House of Lords. We won't say how we're going to do it, but we're going to reform the House of Lords. What were the other ones? There's some other things as well.
Rejoin, single market.
Oh, yeah, single market, and even some, like, allusion to, you know, we might want to join the EU at some point in the future, but we're, you know, not yet.
Yeah.
So just your classic sort of younger people. Notably, no mention of tuition fees. I can't for a second think why. But yeah, I think it was very tailored towards younger people. I think it was very Lib Dem. There was no explicit commitment to rejoin the EU, though. There was some, as I say, some vague thing about rejoining. I think it was rejoining the EU in the future, or was it just the single market? I can't quite remember.
It was just the single market.
Oh, was it just a single
commitment?
market?
There might be some chatter somewhere, yeah.
Yeah. Other than that, though, it was all your classic sort of Lib Dem stuff, sort of trying to be a bit more left. Within the Liberal Democrats, there are sort of two camps. You've got the camp that wants to try and position the party between Labour and the Conservatives, and one that wants to try and push them more left-wing, especially on social issues. I think it's one of the more left-wing manifestos we've seen in recent years.
I think it's also quite left on economic issues. There's some pretty big spending in there. I don't think they fully fund it. I mean, I'm sure they claim that they do, but there's some pretty big spending stuff in there. There's a lot of stuff about social care in the NHS. So
there is. Yeah,
a lot of, and I think that's sort of a bit of an offshoot of Ed Davies' own personal brand and his personal experience as a carer.
Yes.
Which I think, by the way, he released a very touching video for anyone who hasn't seen it about his life and his experience as a carer for especially his son. And I think it complements his like sort of silly stuff very, very nicely. You have the sense of a man who's now this is basically like a sort of eulogy to Ed Davey. I mean, but you have the sense of a man like, you know, he's somehow faced up to all the hardship in life and has come out smiling from the end of it. I'll vote for him. There you go. I've convinced myself.
There's no denying, especially as you say in that video, he does come across as a good person. His background is genuinely really quite sad. There is a lot that's happened in his life. He's lost a lot of people, and he is like a carer. And that the fact that he centered the manifesto around social care and around carers, I think lends him credibility. I think it really gives. I think a lot of the time people worry that politicians say things just to try and get votes, and that video that he released really makes it seem that this isn't something he's just doing to try and get votes. He's doing it sincerely. It gives him credibility that other politicians don't normally get.
But I'm saying is, I think actually you're right on social issues. This is like quite a left wing.
Yes,
or at least it's an appeal to younger voters.
Yeah.
But also, I think on the economic stuff, it's pretty left wing. There's some pretty big spending in there.
there really
it's
is.
not sort of like, well, I don't know what it's more Clegg than Joe Swinson sort of thing.
Yes.
But what I think is interesting is that I think in vibes, I think they're now to the left of the Labour.
Yeah.
I think in sort of like that still doesn't necessarily mean that they're stealing more votes from Labour than the Tories, because I still think if you want to sort of like classic Lib Dem Conservative toss up, they have sort of palatable enough vibes to centrist would-be Conservative voters that they'll convince them over. But I think one of the consequences of this is it squeezes the space for the Green Party,
Yes.
who you would
this
expect
is true.
to be the sort of beneficiaries of Labour's tack to the centre.
Yeah. I just very quickly, before we presumably move on to the Greens, I would say that it's worth bearing in mind. Obviously, I still do think that they've tailored the manifesto very much to younger people, but it's worth pointing out that especially on councils and things like that with the party, they are quite NIMBY, like as a party. And I think it's just worth pointing that out when you're discussing some of that other.
Well, I think this points to so you're basically talking
because
about
housing is quite a big issue for younger people and being able to get on the housing ladder and everything.
I think you need to flesh that out a little bit. So to give some context to people, basically, well, no, it's a very, very good point, but I think it requires a bit of context. What you're basically saying is that the Lib Dems have a reputation in British politics for basically being NIMBYs, not in my backyard, which means that they love blocking infrastructure and housing, and that might play well in sort of like your local constituency, and that's why the Lib Dems do it. They have this whole like local champion vibe that serves them very well in by-elections. But in the aggregate, it's probably not great, because it means you get less houses built, you get a worse housing crisis, you get less trains built, for example. You know, you end up getting very expensive trains and very big bills for the tax.
But just to point out as well, in local areas, and when they do by-election and everything, they produce election leaflets to sort of brag about the housing developments they block. It's not just that they do it. It's that they seem on the local level very proud of the fact
because
that they block
it can play
because
quite
it does.
well
Yeah,
with
I
parts
understand
electorate.
that. Yeah, I agree.
Yeah, of course. But I think it speaks to a wider thing, which is that Lib Dems, in lots of ways, they have the luxury that they're not campaigning for government. They can say, you know, we're going to spend all the money in the world and turn the House of Lords into a bouncy castle and all that sort of thing. And everyone will be like, that's very fun, isn't it? You know what I mean? And Ed Davey can do sillier things than Keir Starmer or Rishi Sunak. And I think that the problem here is that this is fundamentally that this is a small party campaign. It's almost a pressure group campaign, the way they're playing it. But if the polling realises in a general election,
this is it.
They've got to sort themselves out. All of a sudden, they could be the party of opposition, or even, realistically opposition, and then it becomes an entirely different game for the Lib Dems. It's not quite the same as being government. There's not that much scrutiny, but it will be. It will be interesting to see how they react to it as well, but to become essentially not just a local party, but then a national party, because that is a big shift to go from a local to predominantly national.
I still
party.
think, again, it's probably not a good idea to get into predictions, but I don't think it's likely that it'll be Ed Davey will be the leader of the opposition. But I do think
it's Prime Minister.
I do think, though, that it's very likely that they could be within 20, 30, 40 seats of the Tories, which is still incredibly, significant. And I just feel like I'm wary of changing the Overton window so much that it's like anything other than leader of the opposition for Ed Davey isn't significant, because that's just not true. The fact that we're even discussing that is significant. The fact that it's even a vague option on the table is significant. If he gets within 30 or 40 seats of the Tories, that is just ridiculous. That is one of the most successful the Lib Dems have ever been. That is massive. Even when Nick Clegg went into coalition with Cameron, he had something like 50 seats Cameron had, and Labour were hundreds of seats ahead of him. This is 20 or 30 or 40 seats behind the second party is massive.
It would be unprecedented. We don't really know what it would even feel like. I feel the House of Commons isn't even physically set up for it. It's set up for two big parties. You have the opposing benches. What are we going to do? We can't cram 500 Labour MPs onto one side.
No.
They could be haggling Ed Davey from the sides.
Yeah. We'll have Tim Farron sat next to Jacob Rees-Mogg in the Commons. It's just a mad scenario.
That takes us on to the last of the podcast, which is the winners and losers. And I think the reason you sort of preempted this is because we both think there is a pretty clear loser, apart from Rishi Sunak, because we can't just do Rishi Sunak every week, from the last couple of weeks. And that is probably the Green Party, or specifically Clara Denyer.
Clara Denyer, yeah.
Yeah. So for context, on that YouGov poll that we've been playing with this whole conversation, the Greens come in about 8%. And this is both, they're in trouble for a couple of reasons. You did a whole video on it not too long ago. The Green Party have long been beset by infighting, really,
Yes.
if we're being honest about
Yeah.
it. But then I think it's both true they've been squeezed by the Lib Dems as the like fun, in lots of ways, left-wing vote. You know, if you're a young voter and you want to pressure Labour into rejoining the EU or rejoining the single market, Lib Dems is sort of your go-to vote. Also, Ed Davey's a fun centrist dad. Why wouldn't you vote for him? But then also, I think this is true of lots of Green parties across Europe. In many cases, the traditional centre-left party has sort of cannibalised their main policies. I think this is sort of true with Labour, although I think less so now that they've dropped that Green spending 28 billion pledge that they were originally going to spend 28 billion, I think, over 5 years. And now they've said that they can't afford that or they need to check the public finances. But net zero has become a sort of point of consensus in British politics. There was some pushback from parts of the Tory party last year, especially around the Uxbridge by-election. But in general, it's sort of consensus. The 2050 net zero target, as mandated by the Paris Agreement, is something that Labour and the Conservatives agree with. The Greens have tried to differentiate themselves by saying they want to do 2040. By the way, the Lib Dems said 2045. Another good sign of how they're squeezing the Greens. But fundamentally, they're no longer the sort of fun left-wing protest vote or like the sort of fun left-wing pressure group vote. I think the Lib Dems have quite nicely capitalised on that. Maybe not entirely, but... and also their main policy platform has become a Labour policy platform in lots of ways. And then I think the other thing is that they've really struggled to get airtime. And when they do, it's not always entirely successful.
Yes, and that's where this interview on LBC comes in.
We wanted to mention, you saw that. There was Clara Daniel was probably one of a few big media appearances. There was the sort of 7-way debate the other night.
Yes.
Where she did the whole, Tories and Labour are the same.
Yeah, and there was a whole bit where Penny Mordaunt and Angela Rayner were bickering, and she said wasn't that dignified afterwards, which was quite a good... I think that came across quite well for her, and it sort of was quite a nice criticism of, what she's trying to portray as the political class, the classic two parties. It was a very good way of doing that. But I think she was undone slightly with this interview with, what's his name from the news agents?
Lewis Goodall.
Lewis Goodall, yes. And it was about their nuclear policy. And she was sort of asked about getting rid of the UK's nuclear deterrent. And it was honestly just a car crash.
I think what's annoying is that I think her basic point, she had like a point, which is that it's the classic nuclear deterrent argument, which is that like, does it actually work as a deterrent or does it actually invite pressure from other nuclear states?
Yes.
But she used the analogy of a knife.
Yeah, she drew this sort of comparison with someone carrying a knife and that you're more likely to be stabbed by your own knife than to sort of defend yourself with it. To which Lewis Goodall obviously said, "Are you like we're not going to nuke ourselves, are we?"
Can you imagine the size of the inquiry?
Yeah, it'd still come back and say no one's at fault.
Yeah,
but no, it was just one of those really like you could almost see the cogs turning. It was really, really bad.
I feel sympathy / pity for her because I do think that with lots of these smaller parties, so much relies on the leader.
Yeah,
and she has big shoes to fill with Caroline Lucas, who was a sort of de facto leader until really quite recently.
She wasn't actually.
She wasn't actually, but she was sort of the de facto leader.
Yes.
She did stuff like the 7-way debates. She would have been there, and she was just really good at it.
To be fair, I think she was very good in the debate, and I think that so far the campaign has been like there hasn't that being the only big scandal that at least I've come across. The only thing that I've really come across is the debate, and I think she came across quite well in it. She's not been doing terribly overall. I just think that interview was not good for her.
We basically just think there's structural. She's a competent politician, but there's structural reasons that the Greens are struggling, and on top of that, she has big shoes to fill. I think that's fair to say. I think it's true across Europe. You always see that like Green and smaller, especially left-wing parties. Actually, right-wing parties as well. I mean, Nigel Farage is actually a good example of this. They do rely quite a lot on a cult personality. They rely on the figurehead. And, if you're not Ed Davey, that's a real challenge.
Yeah. It really is. Wait, Ed Davey?
Yes, and he's the figurehead of the Lib Dems.
Oh, sorry. I thought we were still... Sorry, I'm with you. I'm with you.
Yeah, you get it. Nice.
This is a car crash for me now. Yeah.
So who is going up this week?
Look...
Should we just do Ed Davey?
That's what I'm going to... Yeah.
Yeah, let's do Ed. It's Ed Davey. Ed Davey's gone up this week. He's gone up 4 points in the polls. He has undeniably gone up.
The reason that I was hesitating there is because, as I said at the start of the podcast, I have had a bit of a, I've...
You don't like it?
Well, no, it's more that I still don't personally like it, but I've come to terms with the fact that it objectively is working for him and other people do. Like I was reluctant a week or so ago to say that this was working for him, but look, the polls bear it out. He is going up in the polls. This strategy is working for him.
I agree.
What more is there to say on it?
Clara Daniel down, Ed Davey up. Thank you very much for watching. And again, I know I don't like to do this, but please do at least consider buying the newspaper, magazine, as it were. It really, I think if we do a lot of stuff about like, various crises going on, explaining what's going on. This is, I think, in some sense, a bit of a more positive project. It's going to be more about like whether or not Labour can fix the UK. And I think for anyone interested in policy and the future, if you're interested in the future, buy the magazine. That's the pitch. I think it really will be a good product. So thank you very much for watching.